In this lecture, we're going to be focusing just on kind of white culture out west and how the Midwest and Western states developed, and how the white population increased pretty dramatically in a short period of time. So white culture out west during this second half of the 19th century really begins with the reasons why people go out there, which is mining and prospecting because of the discovery of gold in different places, including California. Right, so in 1849 we have the California Gold Rush. Right, that's why again the San Francisco 49ers are called that. It's based on this moment in history. But there's also other gold rushes throughout time. There's one in Sioux Territory in the Dakotas, um, in the mid 19th century as well. But towards the end of the 19th century, we actually have one in Alaska, the Klondike Gold Rush, and so that's what kind of leads to the population of Alaska being increased. It's sometime in the mid 1800s. I forget the exact date that Alaska actually is purchased from Russia to become a land that's owned by the United States. But it's not until 1959 that Alaska actually becomes a state in the Union. So you have the mining towns and the prospectors and the gold rush. That's kind of one element of the western frontier during this time. And you also have cowboys and rancheros, right? Rancheros was is essentially the Spanish name and version for cowboys. They have Spanish origins, and their job was to lead the herds of cattle from the pastures to the market towns to be slaughtered and sold. And a lot of times these drives could last hundreds of miles. This is before the railroads become important. And so their job annually was to drive these cattle into market. And so they would be brought into the nearest towns or small cities. That's actually what helps contribute to the growth of these Midwestern cities. Probably the most notable one would be Chicago. Chicago is ultimately essentially the terminal for all this. These cattle would get brought to certain towns and eventually make their way to Chicago. And that was kind of where the meat markets were. And from Chicago, they'd be sent via either train or the Great Lakes to the East Coast, to places like New York City, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and Boston, and even beyond to international markets. This image is kind of showing you some of these famous cattle drives that would happen, mostly from Texas. A particular species of cattle, the Longhorn cattle, would be kind of a popular choice, and they would travel them by foot from places in Texas all the way up north to cities like Denver or Omaha, Nebraska, and eventually to Chicago, right, where the railroad connections were into Chicago then. Right, so those are some of the major jobs, right, that employment opportunities that these white Americans found out west, either mining or farming or cattle driving. Right, and from the beginnings of European colonization efforts in the Midwest and the Great Plains until the year 1870, about 400 million acres of land have been turned into farms in the territory, in the area, which is a large amount of land. But it took a couple hundred years for that, right? And then within the next 30 years, that number of acres doubles, right, in such a short period of time. So the question is, why did that happen so rapidly? And so just take a minute, pause the video, and think, why do you think that could have happened so rapidly when it took 300 years or so before, and now it only took 30? Right, so some of the reasons, if you thought about any of these, right, one is improvements in technology and transportation, right, and that includes the transcontinental railroads, the first of which was completed shortly after the Civil War in 1869, right, when the Union Pacific Railroad Company and the Central Pacific Railroad Companies reached Promontory Point in Utah, was kind of where they finally met to connect this railroad. So now it's possible to get from California back east on one railroad line. In addition, right, in order to kind of encourage the development of railroads, the United States government gave these two companies 10 square miles of every land for every mile of track they laid, right? So that's so the 10 square miles around each mile of track was a substantial amount of land that they gave out, a huge amount of land. And what these companies then did was that they would sell this land off, because it essentially was free for them. They would sell it off for a profit to people to form towns and farmland and things like that. By 1885, just about 15 years or so after the first transcontinental railroad is completed, there's now 5 transcontinental railroads, kind of each segment of the United States. In the north, northern plains, southern plains, right? And so now it's easier and easier to get out west. Right, and the many immigrants who are arriving during this time as well, particularly German and Scandinavian immigrants, begin moving straight out west to start their own farms. That's why the population of the upper Midwest, like places like Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, right, has a large German and Scandinavian ethnic makeup because they all went there, or many of them went there, instead of staying in New York, whereas people like the Irish and the Italians largely stayed in those port cities that they arrived in, particularly New York and Boston. The United States made it federal policy or their goal to encourage settlement of this land. And so as early as 1862, Congress passed what was called the Homestead Act. And this is really important because it offered willing families and eligible families 160 acres of land, right? A substantial plot of land. And they could keep that land if they agreed to build a home and farm that land for 5 years before getting full ownership. So if they did those things and they achieved those things, the land was theirs to keep. So it was a kind of a no-brainer for many people who wanted more opportunity, right? And so millions of people ultimately take up this opportunity to go out west and do this. Right, similar bills that actually failed to pass earlier because southern states had opposed this act. But during the Civil War, the southern states are not represented in Congress, so Congress and the northern states have a lot of power to kind of pass things they want to pass. And so that's what they do. Between 1862 and 1900, 600,000 families, so millions of people, took advantage of this bill, and it led to this formation of several new states. Because once the population of a territory hits a certain amount of people, they can apply for statehood. And so between, towards the end of the Civil War till 1890, you have several new states like Nevada, Nebraska, Colorado, North and South Dakotas, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming all become states. So at this point, by 1890, really the only parts of the United States that are not now officially states are New Mexico and Arizona, Oklahoma, and then Alaska and Hawaii, which come much later on. Right, and this kind of just helps show that, right? This is at the time of the Civil War, towards the end, kind of what the United States looked like. Most of the western states and the northwestern states there are not yet officially states of the Union; they're territories. And then by around 1900, this is what the United States looks like. Right now, everything in red here is a full-fledged state. The blue and green are territories or territories. In addition to encouraging the development and settling of land with the Homestead Act, the Morrill Acts, which were passed in 1862 and then again in 1890, encouraged these new states to create what we call agricultural and mechanical colleges. And so it's the first time the federal government actually gives funds for higher education. At this point, it was really up to individual states or private entities to establish colleges. It's the first time the federal government is giving money to support it. And then, impressively enough, right, by 1890, the updated Morrill Act actually refused to give funds to the states that did not allow non-white students in. So it was kind of a step in the right direction for integration. That a school that was receiving this funds from this act could not prevent black students or Hispanic students from joining. So two famous examples of schools that were founded as a result of these, as a result of the Morrill Act, was Texas A&M, and A&M stands for Agricultural and Mechanical, and these were agricultural and mechanical schools, which focus on teaching new farming techniques and mechanical skills. That was originally the purpose of these schools. And Michigan State is another example of this as well. So two famous schools that still exist today that exist as a result of this Morrill Act and federal funding. And these schools are really important because what they do is they teach the local population, many of whom may not have actually farmed beforehand because they were from the cities of the East Coast. They teach them effective farming techniques, right? They teach them how to farm the best way to produce the most amount of crops and to with the least amount of land, essentially, right? To be as efficient as possible. And so it helps increase the crop supply, which is important. But even as early as this time in the 1870s, right, there's a sense that all of this westward migration, westward settlement is going to harm the natural environment of the United States, the Western United States. In just one day, for example, in 1889, 2 million of acres of land were claimed in Oklahoma, right, with this land buying frenzy that was happening during this time period. That's a lot. And so many people who first went out west saw the amazing beauty of Western United States. It really is. There's so many amazing places to see out there. And they wanted to protect this natural environment. And so these people who petitioned the government are ultimately successful when Congress establishes the first of the national park system, which is the Yellowstone National Park, which is established in 1872. All right, in 1879, the federal government even takes back land they had initially given to those railroad companies with that 10 square miles for 1 mile of track proposition. And at one point, they take back enough land that's equal to the size of New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia combined, right? So a lot of land there. And it might be hard for people here in New York to really fathom this, right? If you've never been out west. We think New York State is big, and it is, right? It takes hours to get from New York to Buffalo. It takes about 6 or 7 hours, right? So it's a big state. The states out west dwarf New York in size, right? I mean, driving through Montana or Colorado, right? Those places are massive. And so just to kind of give you a sense of how big some of this land is that they took all this land back, and there was still so much land that was not, that was open for settlement. So kind of a nice, beautiful picture here of Yellowstone. Other national parks will eventually follow. There's many in Colorado and Arizona and California, right? All throughout the Midwest and the Western states, there's these beautiful national parks. And it all begins with this park, the Yellowstone National Park, in 1872. And lastly for today, right, ultimately closing the frontier. So the United States government officially defined the frontier as a place where there's fewer than 2 people per square mile. That was their judgment of what the frontier constituted. By 1890, the U.S. government declared that the frontier was officially closed because there was nowhere where there was less than 2 people per square mile that was open for settlement anyway. And so that was kind of an important moment in U.S. history because in the American psyche, right, in the perspective of Americans, that's what made the United States unique, right? They could always go westward, right, to the frontier. People in Europe couldn't say that, right? There was no frontier left in Europe. There was no frontier left pretty much anywhere except the United States. At least that was their mentality. And so it was kind of the end of a unique era and a unique way of the United States understanding themselves, right, as this place with endless opportunity and frontier. And kind of from this point, the frontier eventually becomes Alaska, but then it also becomes kind of moving beyond the boundaries of the United States and setting up what would become an imperial nation by controlling places like Hawaii, say, or the Philippines, right, and other things like that. So this is an important kind of psychological moment for the United States. Next lecture, and the final lecture for this unit, will focus on the experience of these farmers that were moving out west and kind of the drawbacks of living out there and how they fought for greater rights and protections from the government.